Okay, well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Daniel Donnelly. I'm the Director of Marketing for Caseworks. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, which is titled Case Fallout in Mass Torts, Maximizing Your Return by Reducing Attrition Rate. We're excited to have such a great turnout today. We look forward to diving into some actionable insights that'll hopefully help your firm to thrive in this space. Before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll address as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And following the session, you will receive a personal email from me with early access to our fantastic new white paper, and that's going to include all of the key data points that we discussed during the session today. So please keep an eye out for that email from me. So now we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to turn it over to our moderator today, which will be the CEO of Caseworks, Dan Miner. Dan, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Daniel. Today we're going to start with a small presentation to share some industry insights on attrition, and then also share some Caseworks data that we believe is going to shed some light on some of the challenges that exist in today's landscape. I'm honored, though, to be joined by 5 leaders in the mass tort and single event space, and I'd like to introduce them. Eric, we'll start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Eckhart. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Angeion, a global class action and mass tort settlement administration firm. I have an academic background in data science and business analytics, and I've been applying that background to the legal industry for the past 15 years, notably in optimizing legal processes for intake and streamlining the path to an efficient settlement and distribution program.
James?
Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is James Helm. I'm the founder of TopDog Law. TopDog is one of the biggest case acquisition platforms in the single event space, and we've also recently gotten into mass torts. So I'm excited to share some of the insights that I've learned with you.
Joe?
Hey, Dan, thanks for having me. I'm Joe Fantini. I'm the managing partner at Rosen Injury Lawyers. We're a national mass tort firm, and we only focus on handling mass torts. We're currently involved in about 8 different mass torts, so I'm excited to speak with everybody today about some of our experiences.
Thanks, Joe. John?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jon Robinson. I am the SVP of Digital Media at Consumer Attorney Marketing Group. I work with law firms all across the country in both PI and mass torts. I also previously held the role of VP of Growth at Litify. I am excited to talk about a lot of the things that I see in the space coming from a marketing perspective as opposed to from an attorney's perspective. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Thank you, John. And finally, Lee.
Hey guys, Lee Melchionni here. I'm a senior counsel at Milberg, one of the largest plaintiffs firms, I guess, in the US here and globally. And then I also have previously spent a fair amount of time in the litigation finance space and interacting with various co-counsels along with attorney fee deferrals. So I've seen it all in this space and appreciate Caseworks and Dan having me here today.
Great. Thank you all. Let's pull up the presentation, and we want to start just with some industry data. This slide shows the fallout or attrition for the last 5 years. The 2024 figure is an estimate. The data comes from Morning Investments. In 2020, fallout rates were about 31%, growing to 35%, then roughly 40%, kind of holding at that 40% rate for the last 2 or 3 years. And whenever someone's deploying capital into the mass tort space, they always want to understand what percentage of that spend is going to be viable. When there are high attrition rates or fallout rates, often due to many different variables, it may impact where they want to deploy that capital. And so I want to start just with, a little bit of an understanding of kind of what's going on in the industry. And Lee, would love to get your perspective. You've had the litigation funding background. You've also had the legal industry in several different capacities, including as an attorney. And so would love to kind of get your perspective first.
Yeah, I think from a fallout standpoint, definitely the mass tort space. I'm not as familiar with single event, but I think it's probably the most important issue that attorneys and law firms face in mass torts, whether you're on the referral side or you're actually litigating and moving forward your own cases. And in my experience, there's some things that you can do to prevent this, right? From an introduction to whoever you are receiving these cases from, asking for a multitude of referrals, and then really digging into that and speaking to them and seeing what their attrition and fall off rates were. And then from your standpoint, once those cases come in, I think that the key issue to determining whether you have a viable or compensable case is medical records. And how quickly can you get those medical records? Can you get a policy where if those cases fall off, would that vendor or company that produced the cases for you then replace them? Another point would be during the intake process is really drilling down with these individuals to make sure basically it's just not fraudulent. I think we all heard Michael Watts speak at MTMP, but I think we can all agree that there's coaching done in this space where people may sign up, but it may not be genuine or legitimate. And so I think those three things in my mind play a key role. Your ability to see the results, past results of the vendor you're using, time you can get medical records, and then during the intake process, really verifying that this individual is legitimate, that actually suffered the injury or took the drug that you're looking for in this particular space.
Lee, you mentioned a little bit about that intake process and even some of the targeting in terms of marketing. Jon, can you comment on some of the things that you're seeing in the space as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Lee is spot on. If we really wanted to dumb this whole concept down, however, I think that we have to look at why the fallout is happening, and it falls into 4 different buckets. As Lee mentioned, is the claimant actually real? Are you getting people who are signing up who are real people who weren't coached? That's the first bucket. And the second would be, are they meeting the criteria? And that is something you can validate with medical records. Are you able to contact them long term to be able to discuss the case with them, eventually resolve the case? And the fourth bucket, the claimant actually opting out of the representation, which is not as much of an issue. These things can each be looked at individually, and I think it's important to know when you look at this attrition that's happening within your firm, which of these buckets is the attrition happening from? And many times it is criteria based. Many times it's contact based. I think that those are things that you really need to look into how the cases are being generated. Do the intake reps have enough training to be able to run the potential claimants through the appropriate criteria and qualification to make sure that they are actually meeting criteria that the firm will accept? Are you getting multiple points of contact? Are you reinforcing the firm that is actually going to be representing the claimant in the cases so that you can avoid dual representation issues? So many things to take into account, but really I think the focus is on the front end side of this operation. And are you doing the things at the beginning of the process to ensure that the attrition remains low throughout and towards the end of the process?
Great. You mentioned intake and having sufficient training. If we move to the next slide, I think that becomes even more important when we think of the differences in fallout between the types of torts. And so this slide shows medical device versus medication. In speaking with attorneys in the space as well as the marketers, this one came as a bit of a surprise. And I think it's a few different factors at play. As you can see, the medication torts have a higher fallout per this data set here compared to the medical device torts. But the medical device torts, one of the challenges that we see there is that the injured party, the plaintiffs, they often don't know what device is inside them. And so when you have a wide variety of devices and manufacturers, trying to understand which of those is the target product can be a challenge. And requesting records is really the only way to do that. The other challenge that you see in the medication torts is that they're often very large populations. And so that can trigger some of these, fraudulent type signups that Lee had alluded to. And so, Jon, I want to dive in a little bit further, but that training component that you mentioned, what are some of the other tactics that these intake teams can do to truly vet these leads before converting them to signed retainers?
That's a great question. And it's really important that everyone understands at what point in the intake process and qualification process is a claimant actually signing with your firm. The longer it takes for you to sign them up, the more quality assurance you do to make sure that they are actually the person who they claim to be, that they have the appropriate diagnosis, that their medical records match up. The later in the process you sign them up, the less attrition there will be. So there needs to be a balance because you don't obviously want to lose that potential claimant, but your process needs to be something that works for your firm. Make sure that you have the appropriate checks in place. It will vary from tort to tort, but make sure you're vetting appropriately and that your reps are trained appropriately. It should not just be reading off of a script. If that is what's happening, you are likely both losing people at the front end because they may not be qualified correctly and in turn not signed up, or you may be signing up people that you in turn should not be signing up. The intake team needs to fully understand, at least at a high level, who the potential claimants are going to be, what their ailments are, what the potential causes are, so they can give a level of trust to that potential claimant on the phone that the firm that they are calling is the right firm to represent them. There are also other things that can be done from a technology perspective. I think making sure that email addresses and phone numbers through checks to make sure that those numbers are real and match up to the names that you're being given. As I mentioned earlier, collecting as many points of contact as you can, multiple phone numbers, email addresses, and making sure that you can get a hold of this person in the future. Should they move, should their phone number change, should their email address change, all various things that you can put into place to help reduce that front end attrition and improve your conversion rate with your intake team.
Great. And James, from a single event standpoint, well-known brand in the space with you, one of the things that we've talked about at great length is the feedback loop and understanding, what is the quality of the marketing and is it converting to signed retainers? Because you may have great marketing content, but you might attract the wrong audience, and having the right intake to vet it. So can you talk through a little bit of some of the protocols that you put in place and taking that marketing, kind of having that feedback loop and converting it to signed retainers as well?
Sure. This has been a great discussion, and I want to echo some of the points Jon's made because I think he gave some great advice in terms of minimizing attrition. I'll just share our experience. So we got really good on the marketing side, but realized that third-party call centers weren't offering us the A level of service and efficiency that we wanted. So we underwent the process of building our own intake center, and we have about 30 to 40 agents currently. We're hiring 10 agents a month or so. Unfortunately, if you build a call center, there's 30 to 50% churn with the hires we're making. Working in a call center is a tough job, and you got to show those staff a lot of love. In terms of best practices, the main issue that we're focused on is speed to contact. And the way that we've been able to improve that is through technology. So as soon as a form comes into your site, having the software built so that gets routed immediately to a rep to make an outbound dial. The less manual selection of when they're making that outbound dial, the better. Ideally, we strive to contact folks within 3 minutes of them submitting the form on our site. And what we've found is there's tremendous differences between the ability to contact people within 3 minutes from the form hitting the site to 15 minutes to an hour. And you'll see that in the data. The amount of folks that you're able to reach if you call within 3 minutes is multiples better than if you wait an hour. We've also seen a lot of success using a branded phone number. If that number, which you need to make sure, doesn't get flagged by the carriers as spam, but if it shows up as a branded number, they're more likely to pick up the call. And there's different services. One we got from Caseworks, thanks Dan, that's helped us tremendously in using our branded number to get more folks on the phone. I think the last thing I'll say, which sort of relates to the point about attrition, is having your reps ask the questions multiple times. For us, if that's, a single event question, or the same thing applies in torts, to really ask them the criteria question in 2 or 3 different ways, just to make sure the rep is totally understanding it, the person does in fact meet the qualification, and it's a sign up. Because if a rep is making, a poor decision, maybe they misheard somebody, maybe they thought it meant something else, then all of a sudden you're signing up this case that you're requesting records on, and ultimately is going to be something that you just drop, which creates inefficiency.
That's super helpful. I mean, one of the things that you just said there, James, is the speed to contact. And those little things, although that's lead conversion to a signed retainer, it also is establishing that relationship with that plaintiff. It's making sure that they're not contacting 2 or 3 other law firms and potentially becoming a dual rep issue down the road. And so that speed to contact means you're getting in front of them early and able to convert them not only to a signed retainer, but hopefully also to be able to solve or resolve their issue and provide quality service to them so that they're not seeking counsel from another firm. I want to switch gears to some of the internal Caseworks data now. And this next slide is likely going to surprise some folks. But what we did with this data set is we took a sample of signed retainers that we've worked on and evaluated the conversion to a compensable case per the criteria of the law firm. And we did that by source. And so we have 3 redacted sources here, A, B, and C. And as you can see, the conversion rates vary wide. So all of these cases follow the exact same process. All of these cases still have potential room for improvement. And so these are the rates after a first pass and reviewing medical records and going out to the facilities. But the quality of the intake is likely what's driving this. And so you can see source A converted to a compensable case at 24%. We think that that's likely going to go up as we contact the plaintiff and ask for potential other facilities. Did they get the hospital that they went to correct? Source B, 72%, may have had very good data in terms of the plaintiff's records, been able to also vet and truly make sure that the injuries that they were claiming were indeed true. And then source C, only 9% conversion. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to recover more with subsequent conversations with the plaintiffs, but that's a challenge. If you've spent a substantial amount of marketing dollars and fortunately only 10% of it is turning into a compensable case. And so I want to ask the panelists their perspective on how do you evaluate when you're starting a new campaign? What are the things that you can do to ensure you're going to get the right conversion rates and minimize attrition? And Eric, you've had some experience in this with data. I want to kind of get your perspective first.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question and a very interesting study on your part. I kind of want to level set. I think there is no 100% retention threshold here. I don't think any firm has ever not experienced attrition. Sometimes the attrition is coming from correlation between impact and value and amount of time it takes, and attrition's happening later in the process, or, threshold conditions being met in especially pharmaceutical torts for exposure, time, and causation to whatever drug. And so I think there are things that we can do to get to that 72% plus on the intake side. There's a lot of science, especially like neuroscientific principles around crafting intake forms for commitment and consistency and value return. So basically bringing people along in the process so you're not asking certain questions right up front, but lower threshold bites that then lead to the more substantive value added questions for actual case evaluation, like the threshold questions. The other thing too, in terms of speed to connection, I think that's a really great point, but speed to substantive exchange is, I think, a better way to phrase it. So as James said, asking the question multiple times, but in a way that demonstrates value, ideally would also establish the foundations for two-way communication so that it doesn't feel like through the intake process, where firms are able to demonstrate value and establish themselves as a resource for the plaintiff, as opposed to just collecting information, and it goes into kind of the black box of law firm engagement in class and mass cases, which seems to be a little bit of a historical trend. The last thing that I would say is, meeting people where they are logistically. So there isn't a silver bullet for, all mass tort cases. There's lots of trauma associated with mass tort litigation, and finding ways to allow the plaintiff to engage in this really important process to mitigate attrition so that they can have representation, without re-triggering their traumatic response is really, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of when we can't get in touch with people later on in the conversation.
Joe, when you first saw this chart, I think you had some questions about who is source B, but what are some of the strategies that you've employed as well to make sure that you're driving conversion and that you're working with the right partners?
Yeah, a lot of kind of what everybody's been saying here, the double verification. Years ago, I didn't know anything about that, but exactly like James was saying, ask the same questions multiple times, and we even have multiple people ask it. So whether it's an intake agent and then going to a case manager, that really helps making sure that these cases meet the criteria. And whenever I start a new campaign, what I want to make sure is we start out the campaign slow so we can really get a feel for what type of cases are coming in, what are the injuries, and what are the exposure. We want to really nail down and make sure that they're meeting our case criteria, which I think should be as tight as possible. And then you can adjust it as it goes along, especially if you're working on a litigation like Zantac, where there's a lot of different cancers out there. If some are more valuable than others, keep an eye on the different type of cancers you're getting. So I would encourage everybody when you start a new campaign is to do it a little bit slow. Really look at every single lead that's coming in, get a feel for what are the injuries there, then get a feel for what your conversion rate is on the signups, get those double verified. And then once you're comfortable with that, likely going to be 2 weeks or so, then you can increase the speed. But what you don't want to do is get ahead of yourself with the spend and the speed of the new cases coming in, because then you could end up with a lot of cases that end up not being compensable, which isn't good for the clients and also not good for the law firm.
Lee, I want to go back to you on this one as well. Like, you've been on both sides of this. You're curious to kind of get your thoughts on holding, both parties accountable.
Yeah, it can be difficult when you're on one side of it and you're relying on someone you're co-counseling with to handle this for you, and you have results that are subpar. Sometimes it's difficult. What resources do you have? I think that you really need to, if you are spending money in this space as a litigation finance, then you really need to dig into the law firm itself, any capital that potentially flows to that firm and then is used to acquiring cases. Can you even go as far as file UCC claims over that firm for the funding dollars that are spent? But then really, I think kind of as everyone is addressed here on the call, is you need to stay involved and you need to work through these processes before you start to spend capital with someone or a law firm, and really dig into those and maybe slow play that or slow roll it. As Joe said, do these double tests before you begin to ramp up your spending and get more involved. And I know it's maybe easier said than done, but it's much better to put the work in on the front end than end up with huge attrition rates on the back end and have to answer for it.
I think there's interesting dichotomy here, right? Like, if you look at how much these A, B, and C potentially cost the law firm, they probably cost per case commensurate with their fallout percentage.
Right.
And I think that's a problem that we have just as an industry, that law firms who are not as sophisticated may be shopping marketing sources based on price, not necessarily based on criteria. And as we all know, that criteria shifts over time, it changes. You even have different firms taking different criteria at different times. As an industry, we potentially should not be endorsing a pay per case model because it's a race to the bottom. We really need to be looking at criteria and running campaigns that align with that firm's criteria. And then what does that actually yield, as opposed to being sold an already signed up case that may not yield the fallout that you are comfortable with.
Yeah, Jon, you're hitting a topic that is near and dear to us. We refer to it as cost per compensable case versus cost per signed retainer. And so it's easy to see the cost per signed retainer and feel that you're getting a deal. But with attrition, there's corresponding cost to actually work up those cases. It could be the request of medical records. It could be the review of those records. It could be just trying to get simple things like a wet signature. But there's cost to work up those cases that ultimately fall out. And then also the return on your marketing. And so, not only does do the lower cost retainers sometimes not convert, but you're also spending time as well as resources to try to work them up. And that's ultimately increases the overall cost per compensable case. Those retainer prices just don't seem to truly represent the actual value of the portfolio or even the value of the case that is in question. So Lee, kind of going back to something that you had said, with the litigation funders and monitoring, how can you drive conversion? How can you make sure that your partner law firms who you're co-counseling with are doing that? I think there are some standard things like reporting and check-ins, but what are some of the strategies that you think you can put in place to hold folks accountable for that? Because you want to try to catch the costs early as well. You want to try to reduce as soon as you can.
Yeah, I think some great points made here is that, yes, you're right. It's like, what does the case cost you to actually get it filed and one that is compensable? And I think, Dan, your question is one that, in my experience, that you need to put that in the contract with whoever you are going to fund. And I think the thought process that everyone has walked through here on attrition, it may seem overly comprehensive or detailed, but you need more than just, here's your monthly report of our cases. I think that you actually want to walk through in the contract of who you're giving these funds to, of what's going to be the intake process, who's doing that, can you do double verification? All these things are, I think, negotiable up front, and you need reporting to show that this is actually happening, maybe even spot checking, because I think this industry, especially retention of clients or sign up of clients, is a little bit of the wild, wild west. And I think what we're talking about here is a great way to put in safety guards or rail guards and checks to make sure that you know exactly what's happening as you are trying to acquire and sign up clients.
I think if we move to the next slide, we can unpack these conversion rates a little bit more. And it goes a little bit to what Lee was saying, it goes a little bit to what Jon was saying, and several of the other panelists. But if we look at source A, just to kind of lay out the structure of this chart, the darker blue is total cases that have been worked. The lighter blue is total cases where records have been received. And so, first step shows that these are valid individuals. These are likely folks who have signed up with a valid name, social security number, birth date, what have you. But then the proof falls, once those records have been returned. And so could be for a variety of reasons, didn't get the right hospitals or facilities, weren't able to request from the right providers, but could also be that the diagnosis just wasn't accurate from an intake perspective. We look at B, which was that source that was overperforming, and you can see the proof of diagnosis is in the records. And so the story there is that there's a ton of work being done at the front end to not only confirm that that's a valid diagnosis, but also to make sure that the information to get that diagnosis, the providers, and where that person went for treatment came through as well. And if you look at source C, again, not necessarily fake names or birth dates or social security numbers, records were able to be retrieved, but unfortunately they just didn't substantiate the case. Now, as I said, with all three of these, the goal would be to follow back up with the plaintiff, potentially request an additional set of records, to work to tighten the time frame for when that diagnosis or treatment occurred. But we look at this, it's clear that these are valid cases. One of the things we haven't spoken about, and I'd be curious to kind of get the panelists' perspective, but making sure that these are indeed valid individuals at the beginning of the process. And that could be identity checks. Some of the lead generation and marketing teams are doing that today. Some of the intake teams are doing that, but would love to get the perspective of Jon, James, and others on how that works.
Yeah, there's a number of different ways that can be done. We have a product at CAMG that does a verification similar to what you would do when you're validating, similar like a passport renewal program, where it scans your face, scan your ID, and then it matches you up to make sure that you are indeed the person who you say you are. So that's kind of a more advanced way to do it. But beyond that, there's technology that you can use to ping a phone number or an email address and make sure that that matches up to the person who you are speaking with. So different ways to approach it. There's also ways that people can get around that. If they're really trying hard and it's a sophisticated operation, it's going to take potentially moving these leads through the funnel and identifying it through even a callback, right? When you call a number back, is the person answering the person who you want to speak to? Are they answering with the same name? I've heard some recordings of some attempted fraud, and it's shocking to the levels that people will go through to show that they are someone who they are not.
Eric, be curious to get your feedback. I mean, you've been deep in data throughout the life cycle of civil litigation. Curious to kind of get your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to see the way that fraudulent filing has evolved on the class action side of things and how that's bleeding over a little bit into the mass tort space. So at Angeion, we've launched comprehensive programmatic fraud detection platform that basically can identify fraud at the point of filing, immediately launch processes to help account for, false negative detection of fraud. In the mass tort space, it seems to be like old school fraud types of behaviors. So what I mean by that, historically, a fraudulent filer in a class action was somebody who was filing multiple claims, 3 for them, 2 for their spouse, 1 for their child, 10 for their parents, all from the same location and with the same payment instruction routing and whatever. We're seeing more of that type of case where someone's trying to file on behalf of somebody else, and thinking they can kind of navigate it that way. But I think, from a fraud perspective, the data on this slide actually shows that most of, or at least a proportion across all 3 providers did a pretty good job at making sure that these were real people and that medical records were securable. It was just really a quality issue. So, quality of case really comes down to educating people along the way about what constitutes a compensable case, as well as kind of overcoming these perceptions. I think some people don't, they see all this advertising with promises of money on the back end, they don't fully understand or realize the amount of commitment. It's not just free money. It's not a class action notice, right? So, educating people along the way for their expectations you won't have people trying to slip one in, when they know they don't have a case, they're filing up because they think they can get away with it. And they think they're getting their money way faster than the mass tort process allows for. So yeah, it's education and, establishing legitimacy early on.
James, anything from your side?
What I was thinking was it's pretty interesting. We don't see fraud in this sense the same way in the single event space. Obviously, defense lawyers will contest the validity of injuries, but rarely is it an issue where the identity of a person needs to get verified. And I do recognize, especially in mass torts and especially as lead generation companies have leaned into the benefit of the compensation as kind of the tool that gets the person to convert through the marketing, there becomes this problem where essentially people want to see if they're eligible or will even say things to make them eligible. On the single event side, it's like you look at the property damage in a vehicular accident and you say, okay, was this a real car accident? Because right off the bat, you can see, okay, if there's no damage to the cars, the likelihood that we're going to be able to prove that this is a serious injury as a result of this accident is minimal. And so it'll be interesting to see. I think it got correctly pointed out by Eric that this is an issue in class, and now over the last maybe 2 or 3 years, it's become more and more of an issue in torts. And I wonder if ultimately it becomes an issue in the single event space as that space gets more mature.
Sorry, Dan, one more thing that I wanted to add there too, and I think you hit on it a little bit before, with the commoditization of lead generation and sales in this space and the structures around the way law firms are acquiring leads doesn't exactly compensate for lead quality. And that's something that I think I would just encourage anybody who's acquiring leads to really push the quality over quantity on the front end from the companies that you're buying leads from, and really partner with them to establish and build out the process, as John mentioned before, because it's not a like for like, and I think your data really demonstrates that.
Yeah, you're hitting one of the things that we try to do on the casework side, which is put some of the checks and balances up front in the process. We'd rather identify that this is not a valid human being up front rather than spend money on welcome calls and medical record requests and everything that would come after that. Same thing with making sure that we're getting proof of diagnosis or proof of injury with these certain types of torts. Our rapid record solutions, we're partnering with many of the leading firms in case acquisition to provide very quick record retrieval to see, is this a valid case? May not get all the information that's required to get it to the settlement table, but might get the proof that shows that it is indeed a compensable case, enabling us to go get a second wave of records to truly make it compensable for settlement purposes. And so whatever we can do up front ultimately reduces cost to the law firm, because they're not spending money on things that ultimately won't turn into a compensable case. I want to shift gears a bit just in terms of contact. One of the challenges in mass tort is duration from when potentially that case is signed to when the flow of funds occurs. And many things can happen. That plaintiff can unfortunately pass, and so we may be working through a next of kin situation that the plaintiff may move, and therefore we have no ability to contact them. And then finally, they may have spoken to many law firms and resulted in a dual rep. And John, at the beginning of this, you mentioned, several reasons for attrition. And, I want to focus a little bit on the back end process, which is what happens when you just can't contact someone? What are some of the strategies that folks should put in place to try to get back in touch with one of their signed retainers?
Very interesting question. And I don't know if necessarily I'm the best one suited to answer this one, because my involvement is mostly on the front end, but I think that it starts on the front end and then continues on the back end. So collecting those points of contact, I think, are really important. Staying engaged throughout the process, maybe a touch point every 30 to 60 days with an email or a text or a phone call, maybe even a direct mail. And that goes not just for mass torts, for PI as well. Staying engaged and having the client remember who you are means that when you do need to reach out to them because you need something from them, you've already had consistent communication and points of contact, and the phone numbers have shown up in their phone, and they've received emails. Those are the types of things I think that you can do on the front end and during the process to help mitigate the need to do it on the back end. But I'd love to hear what others may say about how to attempt re-engagement on the back end if you've lost contact.
Lee, Joe, curious to kind of get your opinion.
I'll jump in here, Dan. It's just kind of top of mind. I had a case actually this week that was resolved for $7.5 million, and was a case that the firm we had originally originated the case for couldn't contact the client. And I think it was actually a process issue on their end in terms of staying in touch. Now, don't get me wrong. This was a difficult client who was changing phone numbers multiple times, changing addresses. But we all know that sometimes those are the folks that we're helping. And it was a case that we actually got through a video follow-up, which is a strategy I've had a lot of success with. If you make a video follow-up, ideally personalized, but if you're doing it at scale, even just a mass video follow-up, I've tended to have a pretty good response rate when someone gets a text message with a video of me saying, hey, we really thought you had a great case. We've reached out to you multiple times, but unfortunately, we haven't heard from you. So we're going to have to close your case. I'm really sorry. And you wouldn't believe how many times we've had people be like, no, I'm sorry. Like XYZ thing was just going through in my life and I didn't get back to you, but I really want to do this. And, then they get back in touch. So I think it's easy to put the blame on the front end, on the vendor, and talk about the incentives being misaligned on the cost per case as opposed to the cost per compensable case, which is certainly an issue. But I think as people who have these large dockets, 20,000, 30,000, 100,000 plaintiffs within our systems and processes, to make sure that we have a constant contact loop so that folks are actually hearing from us. Because I think where a lot of the fall off happens is after, weeks or months go by with no contact, and then you lose contact forever.
Yeah, or they go and fill out a form for another firm, and then you get into downstream dual rep challenges that, are even more of a headache to navigate and certainly lower the compensable value of a case. I agree with all of that. I think one way in terms of the continuous contact and follow up. So I did a lot of work on California wildfire distribution, and that was obviously a case where a lot of people were unhoused and moving around. And so they would change location or contact information 6-7 times over the course of, the period between them filing and the time that distribution. And one of the challenges throughout that time, there was no technology applied for people to be able to update their contact information, and very little communication from the representing firm in this particular instance. And so we always recommend that an online portal be set up for iterative information collection and also iterative information sharing. So plaintiffs can log in, see an update, see the information that they've previously provided, copies of their plaintiff fact sheet, whatever. And also then through that mechanism, when it comes time to distribute, then that's the portal where they go to sign any documentation and ultimately get paid. What this also serves, and I hinted at it before, is if you have a case where there's potential to re-trigger trauma in the plaintiff, and we see this a lot in sexual assault cases, when you have somebody calling and reaching out to engage with a plaintiff by phone or even video, and that plaintiff had a traumatic experience, engagement levels are extremely low. And so I always say you have to meet the plaintiff where they are, both logistically but also empathetically. And creating a low personal touch point for them to provide hard to provide information is a way to continue engagement in those cases. And, we're not just talking about that obvious type of trauma. People have medical trauma also, a lot of it. And so just having those right tech tools in place to help not just nurture, but gather information and provide information definitely mitigates risk of drop off.
Love the ideas. Our KC app kind of becomes that digital solution for interaction. And then we believe that we should stay in touch with that plaintiff all the way through the duration. So every 30 days, email, phone call, voicemail, text, but a mechanism to stay in contact. This is someone who has experienced trauma or an injury. And we want to make sure that we're providing them that wow factor support to get them through this process, even though it's a very, very long journey, specifically in mass tort. Lee or Joe, anything to add to this one?
Dan, I piggyback on what everybody's saying about getting the information up front. And what we try to do is use the portals, and then we also do the call, text, email, and then the mail. So what we want to do is make sure we're not only doing the outbound, but we also want to get the client to engage and respond, whether it's a text message asking them to confirm that this information on their contact and address is up to date, or we send them out a simple form that we ask them to complete and mail back. While we're being proactive on that helped eliminate the drop off down the line. So as Jon was saying, everybody agrees you want to be doing this constant outreach every 30 to 60 days, go to wherever the client is. And if you keep it consistent throughout the process, that will really help get the client the best result and also the firm.
I know we only have 6 or 7 minutes remaining, and so I'd like to do a quick roundtable if we can just move the slide to the last. And the quick roundtable is just, we're heading into conference season. There are many potential partners, vendors that law firms can work with potentially. What are your recommendations for firms when speaking to vendors, and what's that kind of final takeaway from today's content? Joe, we'll start with you.
Yeah, when you're speaking with vendors, you want to always establish that personal relationship. It's a business that we're all running here, but at the end of the day, we're servicing the clients. So there's going to be an individual involved. So I always like to meet with the principals one-on-one, get to know them a little bit. And then also, if it's a reputable company, somebody else here in the space, likely somebody on the panel here has previously worked with them. So following up, getting the information on those referrals and verifications. And then when you set the clear expectations up front, it ends up being a good relationship for both companies involved and then the client as well.
Great. Eric?
Yeah, so I would say I've got two things. One is balance the specific expertise that potential vendor or service provider is providing in the context of the bigger picture, right? So there are a lot of very specialized people who misapply their expertise. You can see it in kind of the revolving door of new companies that are trying to break into the legal space and just fail. The other thing is that there's a lot of novel technology out there, lots of people talking about AI and how to use it in this space, and there's very much an application for it. But evaluate that at least the fundamental rails are the same, because there isn't a whole lot that has changed in the requirements, just the delivery of. I see a lot of people missing the mark in their tech plays.
Lee, we've worked together in a handful of capacities, and I always valued kind of how you viewed partnership, and it was having those conversations. Curious to kind of get your thoughts on vetting vendors as well leading into conference season.
Yeah, I think everything that we just said makes total sense. And then you have to do your diligence. You need to dig into people they've worked with, results they've had, things that have gone well, things that haven't, but really digging in, especially if you're spending large dollars, to make sure that the companies that you're working with can produce the results that meet your expectations, and then setting those parameters up front in writing to make sure that everyone executes. That would be my 2 cents of what to add.
James?
I think I have 2 points. The first one is I think this white paper has really outlined the need to work with a company like Caseworks that can do rapid record retrieval. If you're going to get into a new project, buying leads on a cost per case basis or a range is only relevant if the medical records check out. And the fact that the discrepancy here between source A, B, and C was so wide, I think heightens the importance of figuring out a solution to be able to get quick answers as to whether the records check out on any vendors that you're working with. I think the second thing is just going into this and knowing where you are in terms of an internal infrastructure perspective. The mistakes we've made in the past is when we're like the fat kid at the buffet and we're trying to get into too many projects and we don't have the infrastructure in place to actually work with vendors and closely examine the data as we slowly get started on a campaign like Joe talked about. And when you just get too excited and aggressively start throwing money around is where you get in trouble. And so just trying to temper the amount of new projects that we're willing to start relative to the bandwidth that we have internally to measure the vendors that we're working with.
All good points. And then John, finally.
Yeah, I think there's really three areas that you need to look at when you're evaluating a marketing vendor. First is, what are they doing to generate the cases? And is that ethical? Things like the FCC's new one-to-one consent rule that goes into place in January will significantly restrict what lead generators can do moving forward. TCPA requirements are changing, and firms will have to be listed on TCPA disclaimers moving forward. So do you know everything that's happening to get your cases generated, and is it being done in an ethical way? The second thing I would say is, how transparent are the vendors? Are they showing you all of the ads, everything that's going on in the marketing throughout the intake process, if they're also handling intake, and are your interests aligned? And then the third thing I would say is evaluate their compensation model. The cost per case scenario really only works if the cases that you're getting are the cases that you want. Otherwise, you may want to look at evaluating other models. At CAMG, we do everything on a percent of spend. It's very much mutually aligned, and make sure that the cases that are being generated are the cases that the law firm wants before any campaign is really aggressively scaled. So just ask questions. There should be no secrets. You should know everything that's going on with your marketing vendors, because at the end of the day, as the law firm behind all of these cases, you're the one who's ultimately going to be responsible.
Thank you, John. I know we are at the top of the hour, and so I want to thank the panelists, Lee, Joe, James, Eric, and John, for spending the last hour with us. I also want to thank all the participants for joining today's webinar. Daniel, I'm going to turn it back to you for some kind of final housekeeping items.
That's right. Thank you, Dan. And again, thank you to all of our panelists who joined us today, and thank you to everyone who attended. I'm going to be following up with each of you personally, again, with early access. So all you guys will be early birds to the new white paper. It's going to contain all the data that was in today's webinar. So please look out for that email from me. And if you have any questions, any follow-up items, we can go back and forth on email. We can set something up. So thanks again. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.